In Arrival, we encounter alien beings unbound from time. Louise, a linguist, is tasked with communicating with the aliens named heptapods. Louise begins to see visions of her daughter, which the viewer assumes to have died a year or so before, but in the conclusion of the movie we discover this is a child Louise is yet to have. As we break away from linearity, we break away from Euclidean geometry with its straight lines and angles. The heptapod's cyclical view of time is reflected in the cyclical nature of the shell, the spaceship they arrive in, a homage to life and death manifested in Louise's daughter, who Louise chooses to have despite attaining knowledge of her premature death. The heptapods communicate through a semasiographic language, produced much like a squid excretes ink as a defence mechanism. Unlike our known use of language, in the logograms that appear, a thought can be expressed all at once, with no beginnings or endings. It cannot be read in a linear fashion. Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang is the basis for the film adaptation of Arrival. In Chiang's story, he poses a theory that through the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the heptapodian language Louise acquires rewires her brain and her own perception of time, producing the non-linear narrative. Chiang wrote Story of Your Life with Fermat's principle in mind. Light will take the path that requires least time, meaning that light will change its trajectory when it hits water, with the knowledge that it will travel slower than it would through air. This suggests that light knows its endgame and becomes analogous for the heptapod's experience of time. One of the elements that fascinates me about the heptapodian logograms is the outward motion of inky tendrils, similar to growth in nature. This natural phenomenon is named the Saffman-Taylor instability, referring to the possible paths of a less viscous material as it diffuses into a material of higher viscosity. I attempted to reproduce this effect using the Healy-Shaw cell as a model. By inserting glycerin between two sheets of perspex and then inserting water mixed with ink, one can visualise the path the ink takes through fractals and meanders. I began to think of ink as its own material, and the power it holds as a means of knowledge and communication. If Fermat's principle could be equated to the path of ink, would this suggest that ink has knowledge of its endgame? In Venice, I saw an exhibition celebrating Lucio Fontana and Antoni Gormley. Chromosphere 11 and Ambiente Speziale both use ink as a medium, allowing it to follow its own route. Both paintings draw you in, evoking notions of black holes and the infinite. I discovered that Martine Bertrand, the artist who created the logograms in Arrival, was inspired by Chinese ink art. Zheng Chongbin, with his traditional understanding of ink, illustrates the movement and appearance of light, building up layers of ink over time. With my findings on ink, I worked to produce paintings with ink and water as my primary mediums, simultaneously on 3 large sheets of paper to produce a variety of outcomes. Although I produced the brushstrokes, I allowed the ink to form on its own accord, branching outward as it did in the Healy-Shaw cell. Like Chongbin, I utilised palimpsest. Over several weeks, brushing on ink and water, the ink holds transformative properties. Once I laid down a brushstroke, the ink would branch out and become something else. A day later, and it would have again altered its path. The clouds of ink seemed to depict a celestial event, a reflection of the movement of the cosmos and where the ink is headed next. Is this painting just a deviation of the ink's path? Curls and tendrils of light, matter and time sweep throughout the universe, but the question is, does it know where it's headed? I made sure to leave negative space, so over time, the contrast between the darkness of the ink and unscathed paper created this sense of light navigating around and through the clouds of ink, like the wire sculpture work of Ruth Asawa, who I discovered at the Venice Biennale. Asawa incorporates light and negative space into her practice. I was struck by the intricacy and presence her sculptures seem to hold, all of them hand-woven from wire in infinite loops and tendrils. The loops produce negative space, the wire a navigating light. I began trying to replicate Isawa's weaving technique by looping the wire again and again until the action became instinctive, allowing my stream of thought and the material to decide the overall structure. This became a meditative activity where I created 3 individual small sculptures. What fascinated me most about Isawa's sculptures at the Biennale was the shadows they cast. When photographing these sculptures, I wanted to replicate this effect, allowing the shadows of the structure to become an artwork in itself. By casting a torch onto the sculpture, an infinite mass of loops and tangles emerged. The shadows themselves become representative of our limited perception of time and space. My 3-dimensional sculpture, an analogue of temporal omniscience, cast light through them to become a reduced yet complex version of themselves. To visualise the structures as their own entity, I translated my images into negatives. The shadow of the sculpture appears as a looming presence, an abstraction of light that has filtered through the loops of wire. I adapted this formation, going full circle back to the timeless medium of ink, producing an etching and printing. Now it cannot be erased. Does energy hold the knowledge of its endgame, as we ourselves circle towards our own destruction? We are born with the knowledge of death, as Chang writes, "From the beginning I knew my destination, and I chose my route accordingly, but am I working towards an extreme of joy or of pain?"